my podcast has been up and running again in recent weeks and getting great feedback. Do go find it. Subscribe to the Hypnosis Weekly podcast at iTunes or listen online at www.hypnosis-weekly.com. One of the things I love about the Hypnosis Weekly podcast is that I get to speak to some really wonderful hypnosis professionals from all over the world, some really interesting people. And I open up with the same words at the beginning of my Hypnosis Weekly episodes. Amongst other things, I say the following. That this podcast is something that I want to encompass a feeling of embracing diversity, celebrating the field of hypnosis, encouraging friendly, professional, enjoyable discussion and debate, as well as doing its best to inform and educate. I do not share the same stance as most of our guests and at times have major differences in approach and leaning, but all are incredibly lovely people who I'd happily talk with until late in the pub, and all of whom, following their time here on my Hypnosis Weekly podcast, I have a great deal of respect for. And that's what I say at the beginning of every single episode. Within the field of hypnosis, I've found many people get a bit hostile towards dissenting or differing perspectives to their own. So I wanted to demonstrate that even when I disagree wholly with fellow hypnotherapists' perspective or professional stance, we can discuss it and debate it professionally and courteously, sticking to the argument, the topic, and not veering towards insult or making personal remarks, and ensuring that we're free from the use of logical fallacies to make the points that we support. And that said, a major ethos of my own training college is that we all learn both sides to any debate, any discussion, any philosophy, and we be aware of those sides before we have that debate. And I've spoken about that often here on the Hypnosis Geek YouTube channel. So today I'm talking about feuding, this feuding. When you examine both sides of a debate or discussion, you aim to be fully informed. I find it frustrating if somebody remonstrates with a point that I may make because it goes against what they believe, rather than perhaps adhering to facts or looking at a fuller story. Often in the field of hypnotherapy, what they believe is all that they've been taught, and perhaps they're invested financially and psychologically and emotionally in what they were taught, and therefore they're less inclined to apply this kind of neutral, objective, critical thinking to their own bias and beliefs, and they become entrenched in dogma and defend their stance without knowing the opposing views even. Certainly, don't tend to know what the evidence would suggest in response to their view. A favourite quote from a friend of mine is, learn from people who disagree with each other. And if we examine some of the most important opponents in the history of the field of hypnosis, though the feuds on occasion got unnecessarily personal, what we learned as a result of some of these debates was incredibly valuable. So here now, I just wanted to offer up some grand historical highlights from some of the feuding in the hypnosis field. We have Mesmer versus the Franklin inquiry, for example. Mesmer's popularity brought with it some scrutiny and subsequent inquiry that was labelled the Franklin inquiry because Benjamin Franklin was the American ambassador at that time in Paris, 1780s. And Mesmer refused to cooperate with the inquiry, and eventually the commissioners, amongst many were Joseph Ignace Guillotine, who was famous for something else too, worked with a student of Mesmer's named Charles Delon. Many experiments were performed with participants classed as susceptible to mesmerism. The participant in one experiment informed that a magnetic force had been applied to trees where there'd been no such force applied, and some of the participants responded accordingly and collapsed, having these mesmeric crises. Another experiment was performed with the opposite, where a mesmerist stood behind a screen that passed magnets in front of the participant, who failed to respond to the actions. When the screen was removed and the same technique was used at the same distance, the participant responded. This is some of the first ever real scientific evidence in the field of psychology. And this animal magnetism and other such creation didn't need, or rather, it was a lot of it was down to belief and use of imagination. Some of the only real components that relate mesmerism and hypnotism today tend to be those areas. These were some of the very first controlled psychological experiments, like I mentioned. And this feud helped us to learn about some of the actual underpinning principles that actually produced results in mesmerism, which were contrary to how it was explained by mesmerists, but was useful as a precursor historically to hypnosis. We have James Braid versus John Elliotson. As Braid developed the modern field of hypnotism, he attempted to explain the seemingly mystical and magical apparent effects of mesmerism, and he cast his Victorian Scottish common sense upon the subject that Elliotson offered up this kind of defence for medical mesmerism, and wrote his Zeust journal in response to many of Braid's writings. Braid was able to demonstrate many of his theories through research and left an incredible legacy. Though this bitter rivalry with Elliotson wasn't always unpleasant at times, the debate and discussion highlighted so much that we hold true still today. If you read the entire works of Braid, you'll see how he sought to explain hypnosis in ordinary, usual terms, and how the feuding with Elliotson stimulated much debate that benefited students of this field greatly. And this was really some of the first ever sightings of the state versus non-state debate for our field, with Braid explaining hypnosis as being more ordinary, not a unique state. And in history, this debate was then picked up greatly by the feuding of Hippolyte Bernheim and Jean-Martin Charcot. In addition to Braid and Elliotson's rivalry, Bernheim and Charcot really examined and created a valuable precursor and foundation for that state versus non-state debate. Bernheim even suggested there was no such thing as hypnosis, named his own approach suggestive therapeutics, while Charcot maintained hypnosis was an altered state, and he suggested the ability to be hypnotized was a clinical feature of hysteria. The feud illuminated many. Charcot was prominent in his day because of his charisma and his relationship with the existing medical establishment. If you examine and scrutinize these debates today, you'll find Bernheim's contributions much more akin to academics of today. We then have Émile Coué versus the Nancy School. I'm a massive fan of Émile Coué, not just because of the degree of casuality with which he could carry off a bowler hat and a waxed moustache, but because his work was the historical precursor to the way self-hypnosis is still applied today, a subject very close to my heart, the subject of my books and research. In the 1920s, Coué rejected the Nancy School and went on to rename his own approach autosuggestion, and the book by the same name went on to be an international bestseller of the 1920s. He rejected heterohypnosis because he discovered that people could simply reject suggestions, which was disputed by other schools of thought on hypnosis. If people could reject suggestions, it made sense for him to therefore teach people how to give themselves suggestions in the most effective way. Then we kind of come on to hypnosis and the theory wars of the 70s. Primarily this involved prolific researchers Theodore Barber, as he kind of dismantled the criticized hidden observer theory proposed by Ernest Hilgard, but involved a lot of other authors, researchers, and academics. Again, there was a lot of state versus non-state, but it focused more on socio-cognitive theory versus dissociation theory at a time that modern research methods were introduced to scrutinize hypnosis. It was a very productive time for hypnosis theory. There was lots of research that was carried out at this time. Nicholas Spanos was very prevalent in those days as well. We have Ellman versus Erickson, two of the most popular authors and hypnosis trainers who feuded too. If you ever get to ask Larry Ellman his thoughts and experiences of Milton Erickson, as I did on my podcast edition with him a couple of years ago, you'll get a very colourful account of some of what went on within this rivalry. The differences within their approach also served to make their approaches so prominent. If you examine the research on the field of hypnosis, there's virtually no mention of Dave Ellman. Additionally, the studies on Erickson's approach, at least 4 more well-constructed studies, are very few. Yet their differences in approach made their books incredibly popular, and the differences accentuated the finer distinctions that are taught around the world today. Both sides of the feud got heard, scrutinized, and understood, and it made a big impact. I was speaking at a conference a couple of years ago, and a lady selling books for the Anglo-American Book Company asked me what kind of hypnotist I was, direct or indirect, Ellman or Erickson. And, as I've said in a previous video, to imply that these were the only 2 options available in this field, despite the truth being that in real terms, these are very small contributions to the actual depth and breadth of this gloriously diverse and richly large field. There's more to it than that. More recently, we have Michael Heap versus the field of NLP, which he comprehensively critiqued in the early 2000s. Heap published a number of papers about NLP, aspects of NLP. Go find his NLP critique website, where you'll also have access to his papers that were published by the Skeptical Intelligencer and the Association for Skeptical Inquiry. They make for some very interesting reading. He asks major questions about the validity of eye accessing cues, about whether or not matching and mirroring is really a thing at all, and also cites numerous critiques of a number of techniques. He suggests that though some of the techniques cannot be proven to be effective in research experiments, perhaps they work because NLP practitioners have so much belief invested in them. Their own belief fuels the change in individuals that they work with. Likewise, there's much more debate and healthily skeptical appraisal to be read and examined online. Andy Bradbury wrote a well-circulated paper that was a rebuttal of Heap's critique, and the debate was healthy, as it led to many properly questioning what was best for their clients and patients and so on. I know a great many very well-respected NLP authors and trainers who are not interested in acceptance from the field of psychology. And as Richard Bandler suggested during a radio interview, he suggests that it doesn't think that NLP is right to be tested in the more formalized clinical environment of research labs. Richard Dawkins, in his book Unweaving the Rainbow, describes how understanding the scientific reasons that a rainbow is created and occurs does not make it any less beautiful. Yet I do tend to think that many of the opponents to the critique of NLP by Michael Heap thought that way. These small snippets about these feuds do no justice whatsoever to the real debate that ensued at the time. They're exponentially more than I can do justice to in a small video like this. There are many more other debating, feuding, hypnosis academics and scholars that we can learn much from. And that's the main point for me today, that we can all benefit from the spoils of those disagreements, those feuds, the information the debate stimulated, the questions asked, the attempts at answering them, the scrutiny paid to our subject. I think it is a wise move to learn from people who disagree with each other, and especially so in the field of hypnosis and hypnotherapy. Rather than digging our heels in and blindly defending one singular stance, learn both sides of the discussion, understand the full depth of the argument, and allow yourself some enlightenment. I think it's important, especially for hypnotherapists, to be able to see at least, but ideally fully understand both sides to a philosophy, a debate, a theory, and so on. And that's what shows open-mindedness. It shows intelligence. It shows that you know your subject and your field, and that you're the most considerate with how you're going to assist your clients. The field of hypnotherapy, as with many, many other fields, has a proliferation of this kind of phenomena where people don't know both sides. The field of hypnotherapy benefits from these debates. It benefits from the feuding. Yet the feuding's got to be with a view to learning and developing, and not with a view to simply entrenching ourselves in dogma or bickering unnecessarily. That's it today. Do subscribe to this channel. Do go visit my college website. I send you my very best wishes. Goodbye for now.